The video was from 2018, so some of the leaders are obviously not in place these days. Welcome, Kalos orisate, to a book launch like no other. I would like to begin first by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. My name is James Salakis. Many of you know me by one of my many aliases, Jimaki, Jim, Dimitri, whatever. We all have aliases in the Greek community. I'm the Committee Secretary with the Athenian Association of New South Wales. I'm also the President and Founder of the Australian Hellenic Choir, and I am a member of a HEPA. I thought it better to disclose my interests, given there is so much law in the room this evening. I am your chair for this evening. I'm also the first aid guy, and I've got plenty of first aid stuff here if anyone hurts themselves, okay? The toilets for the men are at the rear, the ladies are up through the corridor here, and there's a handicapped toilet just here near the entry. Firstly, I'd like to begin by acknowledging a number of people in attendance this evening. Mr. Christos Karas, Consul General of Greece in Sydney. Ms. Katia Gizikas, Trade Commissioner of Greece in Sydney. Mrs. Kathy Vallis, President of the Athenian Association of New South Wales. Mr. David Hill, Chair of the Australians for the Return of the Parthenon Sculptures. Mr. Bill Skandalakis, President of AHEPA, New South Wales. Miss Andrea Connell, Principal of Sydney Girls High School, and a big thanks, but George will take care of that later. Miss Stergica Zamias Hill, CEO of the Hellenic Initiative Australia. Miss Liana Verdzayas, President of the Hellenic Lyceum Sydney. Mrs. Maria Anthony, President of Pontoxenichties, New South Wales. Professor Vrasidas Karalis, Chair of Modern Greek at the University of Sydney. Mr. Mark Fennell, ABC journalist, radio and TV presenter. Presenter of the ABC podcast, Stuff the British Stole. I'd like to see that. Media partner, Greek City Times. Publisher, Mr. Bill Yanakouras. Miss Elaine Kintis, Greek Herald newspaper. Mr. Themis Kalos, executive producer, SBS Radio, who's given us a real big plug over the radio the last few days, which is great. Thank you, Themis. Event management supporter, Mr. Dennis Tritaris of Orama Communications, producer of the upcoming podcast, Talking Marbles. I'd like to see that. We acknowledge the support of Mr. John Lefas and the Lefas Humanitas Foundation, who also have sponsored the Greek edition of Who Owns History. This evening's event is hosted by two naturally aligned entities, the Athenian Association of New South Wales, who guard the Acropolis, and who since 1953 have supported many cultural and historic events and programs to keep the spirit and soul of Athena alive in Australia, and co-host the Australians for the Return of the Parthenon Sculptures, who since 2002 have supported and delivered many programs and events in support of the reunification of the Parthenon sculptures, both locally and internationally. This event this evening is being sponsored by AHEPA New South Wales. AHEPA is one of the oldest Australian Greek charity organisations in Australia, having been established in 1934 in Werris Creek and Scone. They have raised millions of dollars in that time for medical and education purposes. We thank AHEPA for their generous sponsorship. I encourage you to go over to the desk later after this is all finished and have a chat to them about joining AHEPA and seeing what sort of contribution you can make to some of their charities. I will now call on Mr. David Hill to introduce our guest and author. David has been a journalist, an investment banker, an accountant, a board member, a director, a chairman of many organisations. Between 1986 and 1995, he was chairman and MD of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. 1995 to 1998, he was chairman of Australia's Football Association. In 2005, he graduated in classical archaeology from the University of Sydney, and since 2010, he has been the project manager of the archaeological study of the ancient Greek city of Trojan. He has authored a number of best-selling books, and he is the current chair of the Australians for the Return of the Parthenon Marbles, sculptures. Please welcome a great Philhellene, Mr. David Hill.
It is so heartening to see so many people here in support of this great cause. It reinforces and strengthens my optimism and my confidence that inevitably one day we will see epistrophy, the return of the sculptures to Greece where they belong. The British government and the British Museum are increasingly out of step and out of touch with the rest of the world. World opinion overwhelmingly, and for many years now, has supported the return of the sculptures. Enlightened museum modern practice would dictate the return of the sculptures. Even public opinion in the UK has for years overwhelmingly supported the idea of the marbles being returned to where they belong in Greece. Britain has no friends. If you look around the world at the people that are advocating the return of the sculptures and those who are supporting British retention, Britain has no support, not even among its own public. And yet, as recently as last month, Boris Johnson slammed the door again and said they're not going back. He said it would be impossible for them to go back. And we haven't had much luck, I have to say, in the last 20 or so years with Labor governments, because Tony Blair and Gordon Brown had the opportunity and turned it down to do justice to Greece and to the rest of the world. Boris Johnson is probably the hardest liner of the lot. He goes back a long way on this. Boris Johnson, in 1986, was the chairman of the Oxford University Union when the wonderful Melina Mercouri reinvigorated the modern campaign for the return of the Parthenon sculptures at Oxford University. And why I remember it is because I think Melina Mercouri captured better than anybody else the importance of the marmara to the Greek people. She said, and I'll quote, "You must understand what the Parthenon marbles mean to us. They are our pride. They are our sacrifices. They are our noblest symbol of excellence. They are a tribute to the democratic philosophy. They are our aspiration and our name. They are the essence of Greekness." And I think nobody has been able to articulate to the Greek soul how important the sculptures are. You'll be pleased to know that Australia has been a very active and prominent member of the international campaign for the return of the marbles for many years now, in challenging the British Museum and the British government, in supporting Greece, and even taking a hard line with Greece sometimes, urging them to take firmer action with the British. The Australians for the Return of the Parthenon Sculptures is one of 18 countries that have volunteer organisations like ours supporting the return of the Parthenon marbles. Incidentally, for those of you who are of like mind, if you haven't already, we'd welcome you to join the Australians for the Return of the Parthenon marbles. And if you haven't done so already, Therese will be sitting over there at the end of tonight's meeting, and we'd welcome you to sign up. It won't cost you anything. For many years, the patron of the Australians for the Return of the Marbles was the wonderful Gough Whitlam. And he had a remarkable knowledge of Greece and its history and the Parthenon. Gough was very proudly a classicist. I went to visit him about 20 years ago. His last overseas trip in 2004, I went with him. He was the keynote speaker at the London University conference of the Institute of Art and Law, and Gough gave the keynote address presenting the case for the return of the marbles. And what was remarkable about it, he prepared the entire speech by himself without the help of any researchers. But the point I wanted to make about Gough was he was a constant source of guidance and support for me as chairman of the Australian organisation. And about 20 years ago, when I was visiting him, his offices were in William Street, And when I went to visit him, as I regularly did to bring him up to date on the marbles, I remember one day he said to me, "Comrade, when next you're in London, talk to Geoffrey." And I did, and I'm glad I did, because Geoffrey Robertson's impact on this campaign has been powerful and dramatic. In 2014, which is already 7 years ago, I arranged for some eminent lawyers, international lawyers, to go to Greece to advise the Greek government, the Prime Minister then was Andonis Samaras, on their legal rights and their legal options. And the delegation we took to Athens included Geoffrey Robertson and the wonderful Professor Norman Palmer, who many of you know, but he tragically died in 2016. And you might remember that time in Athens because Geoffrey invited along one of his barrister colleagues from his chambers, a woman called Amal Alamuddin, who 3 weeks or so before our meetings in Athens married George Clooney, the actor. And consequently, the media, I've never seen anything like it, the media coverage for the Parthenon was greater than anything we've ever been able to generate before, or probably ever since. And I'll add that to the list of Geoffrey's contributions and achievements for us. Geoffrey Robertson is an inspirational figure. He embraces social justice and human rights issues, and we can only stand in admiration at his achievements. He's also a winner, and that's what I like best about Geoffrey. He doesn't just fight, he fights till he wins. And we're hoping he's going to do the same thing for us with the marbles. He is a great Australian. Ladies and gentlemen, Geoffrey Robertson.
Well, thank you, David, for that overkind introduction. Well, it's great to be here, and it's great to be talking to you about something that's become a passionate cause for me, although I have no Greek ancestry other than that which we can all, as Democrats, claim. Because for me, the marbles are not Greek, they are all. They belong to the whole world because they are the expression of an idea that began in Greece with those of Pericles' generation back in 450 BC, 2,500 years ago. The idea of democracy, the idea of individual liberty and dignity, and there in the pantheistic procession, captured by the enduring genius of Phidias, you have this idea, the idea that individuals can meet together in democratic society and enjoy their life, their freedom. That procession, which is like, an ancient newsreel. Can you imagine looking at a black and white newsreel of 450 BC? That is what it is, and it is a picture of the beginning of civilization. It's a difficult word to use, you've got to be careful. But what we see in Athens in 440 BC is the first picture of modern democratic society. People walking, talking, drinking, a lot of drinking, celebrating, playing sport, playing music. This is the first example, the first picture of human civilization. And it is a government, as Pericles said in his funeral oration to the fallen, he said, "We are a government of the many not the few. And he set out how that democratic state, under his guidance, had evolved as early as 2,500 years ago, the basis of democratic government that assured a life of dignity to all. Look at the marbles, look at that procession. They're taking stools and seats up for the elderly. There is a concern in that society for the poor and for the disabled. They are allowing immigrants to watch the procession because Athens had a very liberal approach to immigrants who could belong. They couldn't always vote, but so long as they paid taxes, they were regarded as members of the society. And in all these ways, we can see the seeds of our own values and civilization. So that, for me, is what makes the reunification of what undoubtedly is the greatest survivor of the ancient world, the Parthenon Marbles. That is what it means to see them together, reunified under a blue Attic sky, underneath in the shadow of the Parthenon. In my book, I juxtaposed two pictures, the picture of the new Acropolis Museum with the Parthenon seen through the window, and the picture of the Duveen Gallery in North London, a gallery which is named after a fraudster. Duveen, Joe Duveen, was a corrupt art dealer. He was a Jewish art dealer who bought paintings that had been confiscated by the Gestapo from his own people. That was the lowlife that Joseph Duveen was. And he had pictures falsely attributed, and he bought his knighthood, and he bought his lordship, and then he bought the British Museum. He bought the Duveen Gallery. And you know, the first thing he did, he said, I want those marbles whiter than white. And of course they weren't white. In Greece, they were a riot of color. That was what made them stand out. But he paid for workmen to use crowbars and chisels and to get all the original paint off the marbles so that they would be quite anachronistically white. That was Joseph Duveen. The cleaning scandal of 1937, hushed up as by the Lord Chancellor and by the trustees of the British Museum, that the marbles had, in the custody of the British Museum, been desecrated. How did they get there? Well, the British Museum has lied from the start, and as soon as Greece made an effort to get them back, and I have to say, the King of Greece in 1836 made the claim on behalf of Greece for its stolen property to come back. Almost 200 years of useless diplomacy has followed, and it must surely be time to look elsewhere, because the British government this British government will not cede the marbles to Greece, nor will the trustees that they've appointed. So the only way, if Greece is ever to get the marbles back, is the law. And I'm going to explain that in a minute. But first, I should say that the marbles were stolen. Let me tell you what life was like in 1801 in Athens. There were only 10,000 Athenians, Greek Athenians, there was an occupation, military occupation by the Ottomans. Now, the Ottomans had one thing going for them. They protected temples and cultural items. They recognized that they were custodians for the people in the areas they occupied. The French, who were ahead, even more greedy than the British Museum, tried to get hold of the marbles in 1780. And the Ottomans said, no, you're not, you can pick up rubble and pieces from the ground. There had been, in previous centuries, a couple of explosions which had left the marble, some of the bits and pieces in rubble on the ground. So that's okay, but you must not touch the walls of the temple. Well, the French were sent off. Now then came Elgin. Elgin was a Scottish Tory of limited intelligence, but he wanted very much to be an English lord. He was just a Scottish lord. No big deal. And he thought that he would make himself an English lord by, so he was advised, by having his Scottish property adorned with artifacts that had been pictured, painted, molded from the Parthenon. He didn't envisage when he went off to Greece as British ambassador that he would steal the actual marbles, but he put a team up that would make moldings, copies of them. That was all he wanted to begin with. But as luck would have it, his chaplain, who went there before Elgin did, found that the two Turkish governors who were in charge were open to corruption. Such corruption I investigated why, I was able to actually discover some of the things that were paid in order that they would turn a blind eye and allow Elgin's workmen to rip these masterpieces off the temple. Well, they were paid in large sums of money. They were given pistols encrusted with diamonds. They were given telescopes with gold. They were given golden watches. They were given British snuff boxes. They were given horses and tailored suits from Piccadilly. These were parts of the payment for the marbles. Elgin knew that he couldn't offer money to the government because they wouldn't accept it. His only way of getting hold of the actual marbles was to bribe. And that's the corrupt basis on which he got access. His men were not molested when they stripped these wonderful statues from the temple. Where did they take them? They took them to the backyard of the British consul, where they were secretly kept. And then when the next British naval ship came by, they were put on board and delivered back to the Foreign Office in Britain. That was because Elgin was the British ambassador. So he was doubly villainous, firstly because he was stealing from a temple, and secondly because he was using his influence as British ambassador to make a profit for himself. He never paid a penny legitimately for this wonderful cultural property he was taking. He took it like a thief in the night by corrupting the people who should have been guarding it, not by any government. Now, the British Museum has had to find a story to explain what is absolutely clearly theft, arranged by corruption. And they've had various attempts. They've tried to say, oh, he had a firman being a license from the Sultan. We've looked in Istanbul, the old Constantinople, every firman ever given between 1800 and 1810, and there is, of course, none. There is the only thing he's ever been able to produce was a letter asking the governor to help his workmen mold, enter the Parthenon area to make moldings and drawings. That's all. And to pick up rubble from the ground. That is all he was allowed to do, all he was ever able to show that he had any license to do. So that is plainly false. I mean, the British Museum is a receiver of stolen property. There is no alternative to the fact. Now, in 1816, Elgin, penniless, suffering all sorts of sexual diseases, and in great debt, his wealthy wife had left him. He wanted to make money out of the marbles. So he put them up for sale, and there was an investigation. And you know what? He came to give evidence, and he lied through his teeth. He said, when I came to Athens, before I allowed my workmen to touch the temple, I saw these terrible Turks picking up, not just picking up, but taking from the temple. And so I thought it would be responsible for me to save these wonderful marbles, which I want you to pay me a very large sum of money to donate to you. The British government bought this story, but I did some careful investigation, and I discovered that Elgin never got to Athens until a year after they started ripping these statues from the temple. So that was simply a lie. It was very amusing because while I was writing the book, there is an area outside the gallery where they tell whatever the current story is about how Elgin got them legitimately. And they, after my book was published, they ran a story that there was a fellow called Rashid who was the most senior Ottoman official in Athens who'd given approval. And that was something I was able to destroy because Rashid was nothing of the sort. He wasn't senior, he hadn't given approval, and so forth. So then the British Museum took down this story, and there is no mention of Rashid, the approval giver, if you go out to the gallery today. It is simply lie after lie after lie. And in any court case, it would be so easy to disprove, to show that the museum lies about the legitimacy of Elgin's theft. It is, of course, British law acquired, the British acquired from Elgin, bought for £35,000, many millions in those days, the marbles, but and passed a law that donated them to the British Museum. But that's British law. There's no way you can go into a British court and claim the marbles back because British law stops you, stops the Greek government. But international law is different. And in my view, the view of Amal Clooney and Norman Palmer and of other eminent international lawyers, international law is not bound by domestic law, and it can be argued, it is time to argue, that cultural property which is wrongfully acquired by colonial powers should be restored to the country from which it has been stolen. And it's very interesting because we've been battling, the battle has taken a number of stages. I think the beginning, and I think what attracted David initially perhaps to ask me, or Gough Whitlam to ask me, was that I'd acted for the Tasmanian Aboriginals in getting back the remains, the human remains of their ancestors, which had, there was a terrible genocide in Tasmania in the 1830s, and a lot of the graves were robbed, and human remains, skeletons were sent back to sit on Victorian mantelpieces as some sort of curio. And a lot of them ended up with the Natural History Museum, one of the, like the British Museum, one of the great museums. And I got a call from Michael Mansell, who is an Aboriginal activist in Tasmania, and he said, the museum is about to experiment on our ancestors. They're going to subject them to a DNA test. So I said, can you stop it? I rushed into court and got an injunction to stop the museum experimenting. And the museum council made a big mistake. He said, they're our property, the skulls and bones. We're only going to cut them about a bit. To which I replied, what they're going to do is experiment on the remains of victims of genocide. Because it was a genocide, and that was reported, and the museum immediately gave up and mediated and gave back the human remains to the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, where they took them back for proper burial. And that case established the right of people to have their ancestors that had been sent over for macabre curiosity purposes returned. And so I thought, if human remains, if there's a right of return, so there should be for cultural property, so that the descendants of the people who worked it can have this satisfaction of knowing that and being inspired by the work of their ancestors. And so we have, that was the first time we were approached, I think, by David and Dimitri Dollis in 2011. And we gave our opinion that international law held this prospect, and only this prospect, for retrieval and reunification of the marbles. And then something interesting happened in the world. And as a strategy, I recommended that it be coordinated. And that's why I wrote the book, because it's not only Greece. In the world, in the 17th and 18th and 19th century, barbaric things happened under the banner of colonialism. When I was a kid in the 50s, we were told that, well, Australian culture didn't amount to much other than sport, but British culture, you had to study the British civilizing missions of the 19th century, where they went and spread Christianity and civilization to countries marked red in our school atlas. And of course, they didn't tell us about the barbarity and the brutality with which the British Army killed men, women, and children and stole their cultural property, particularly if they were made of silver or of gold, and they were taken back to British museums. And of course the French did the same, and the Spanish, Portuguese. The British perhaps were the worst. In 1853, and you may wonder why Xi Jinping, who's so unpopular in other respects, is fully supportive of Greece's demand for the marbles. That's because Chinese were inflicted by Lord Elgin's son, who in the course of the war, the dreadful war that the British and French fought against the Chinese in the interests of the heroin trade. They wanted heroin to be freely traded in China. But they attacked, French and British army attacked the old summer palace, which had, outside Beijing, which had all of China's, or most of China's great cultural objects. And they stole them and they sold them, and the British put the palace to the, not just to the sword, but burnt it down, burning down lots of palace servants at the same time. It was a monstrous action, and it was taken, ironically, by Lord Elgin's son. The French wouldn't be part of it. They joined in the theft, which all colonial countries did, but they wouldn't be party to killing the servants. Well, there it is. That's why China is supportive. There is a lot of support around the world for repatriating stolen property. President Macron started it in 2018 when he said African culture should not be a prisoner of European museums. And that was the beginning of his efforts to return to many African countries the cultural objects that have been stolen by the French army, including the extraordinary masks from Dahomey that had inspired Picasso. If you want to know where Picasso got his inspiration, just look at the masks that were put in the French museums after colonial theft. Well, that has a resonance, the restoration of cultural property, that most countries in the world now accept. In 2018, Greece put a motion through the General Assembly about restoring cultural property, and 105 nations voted in favor. Now, what's the importance of this? The importance of this is that it opens the door to international justice. It opens the door to the International Court of Justice. Britain will never accept a case brought by Greece because it has carefully written itself out of being a defendant. But it has no alternative if the General Assembly of the United Nations requests an advisory opinion. Britain must go along with it. There would be a court hearing. Greece would be able to put its case. Britain would be able to put its case. Any other country could come in. Australia would have the opportunity to argue for the return of the marbles, the reunification of the marbles, for the principle of international law that cultural property stolen from a country must be returned to it. And that is a principle that many of us think that is now ripened into a rule and requires the court to declare it. So that is the strategy to get a court case, because there is no other way. Britain will never return the marbles. marbles. The trustees will never return the marbles. You've got to understand there is a very complicated setup where there is a law that prevents the trustees from returning any property. They'll give it back on loan. I saw that woman lying, as usual, to the to the interviewer, saying, of course, we'll allow Greece to have a loan. Neil MacGregor, the long-term head of the British Museum, and I and Amal had a number of secret meetings in the course of 2014, and Neil MacGregor made it absolutely clear that for all that they would say publicly, they would never loan the marbles to Greece. Why? Because they were sure that they would never come back. And so there's no way that they will loan it to Russia. The river god went off to Russia for Neil MacGregor's, what he called cultural diplomacy. Putin had just closed the British embassy, had just invaded Ukraine, and irresponsibly this maniac sent the river god from the marbles to Putin so he could bare his chest in front of it. But that's the British Museum's idea of cultural diplomacy. So I'm afraid it has to be a legal strategy. And it's good, I think, that Greece finally comes to realize this, because ever since 1836, its efforts of diplomacy have failed. You heard about Melina Mercouri in the film. I'll tell you what actually happened. She was getting a good audience. A lot of people in 1836 and in 1986 were supportive of her, but there was another woman in the question who didn't like her, who felt threatened by her, and who determined to change British policy. In the Amal and I discovered some documents, wonderful documents in the Foreign Office, in the 40s, starting in the 40s, saying we should give the marbles back to Greece. They're our only friend. And in fighting the Nazis, the Greeks were on our side, and no other country was. It was either occupied or collaborating. But there was a long point between about 1940 and 1960, and really 1980, when the Foreign Office was writing memos saying we should give the marbles back, they belong in Greece. But Mrs. Thatcher took such a distaste to Melina Mercouri that the British position was changed, and never again was it suggested that the marbles could be returned, other than, of course, by Jeremy Corbyn, who sadly perhaps did not succeed and is now history. And as far as the government is concerned, until 2024, when there's another election, the marbles will remain in the British Museum unless there is a legal case which will give Greece the opportunity to put all the evidence in front of the world that there was no license, there was no firman, there was no, the claims that have been made over the years are bogus, that Elgin bribed, the evidence of the corruption and bribery is clear. Those jewel-encrusted dueling pistols that were paid to the corrupt Turkish officials to allow this cultural plunder to take place, and, of course, to argue the moral position that thieves should never benefit from their crime. So, that is the strategy which may, under the present government, and I've been impressed by my meeting with the Prime Minister and and his wife and his other of his cabinet, that I think when the pandemic is finally beaten, that there will be effort to this end. And if we manage to have a reference to the International Court of Justice, that will be an opportunity for Australia to show where it stands, and that is where your support will be enormously important. John Howard was always mindful of the number of Greek people in electorates, particularly in Melbourne, and of course in Sydney. So I would hope that Australia will be on the side of Greece when it comes to an international court showdown. Now, they are some of the ideas that I've expressed in English in one book and Greek in another book that are on sale tonight. It's a great pleasure to, and I add my voice to thank John Lefas and the Lefas Foundation for their support for the Greek version, and John is one of the great progenitors of the idea of taking Britain to court. So he deserves great support in that respect. I think I would only say this, that having visited Greece and spoken to those who would prefer a diplomatic route, there is a kind of strange, I call it the Navarino syndrome, this idea that Greece is indebted to Britain. Of course, the British Navy at the Battle of Navarino back in 1821, with a little French ship and tagging on, beat the Turks and the Egyptians and secured paved the way for the independence of Greece. And that's fine. And yes, the Second World War is another factor. But what you have to understand is that the British don't mind being sued. They love litigation. This is what they act on both sides. And they, unlike any other country, they abide the result. Because William Gladstone, back in the 1870s, Britain got a terrible judgment from an international court on a shipping arbitration. He said, this is a dreadful judgment, but it's more important that we comply with it, because international settlement of disputes by courts is so much better than settlement by war. So one of the few things that make Great Britain great is that it obeys international legal decisions. It's been sued, the Chagos Islanders have taken it to court and beaten it recently. Most British people agree that their cause is just, and I think most British people agree that the Greek cause is just, so that you will not alienate Britain by suing them. If anything, you'll love them, they'll love you more. It's completely mistaken to think that this is somehow going to end a relationship which is, you have no idea how desperate millions of British people are champing at the bit to get onto the Greek beaches this summer. And well, I kid you not. So the friendship will always be there. But at the end of the day, the British will accept a court judgment which tells the truth that the British Museum has tried so long to cover up, that the marbles were stolen, that they belong in Athens, so the world can see not just the glory of Greece, but the glorious beginning of democracy. Thank you.
It now gives me great pleasure to ask Mr. George Vardis, Vice President of the Australians for the Reunion of the Parthenon Sculptures, to come up and give the vote of thanks. This guy is the real deal, folks. Okay? Is that right, George?
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That is, this may be a cliche, but that is an incredible act to follow. Geoffrey personifies the passion of the quest for the return of the marbles that so many people have embraced. Those of you who've turned up today, those who are watching on the live stream, understand the passion behind that. And you've been lucky to have a tour de force presentation where in the space of half an hour, he's taken you through all of the issues and succinctly put into proper context what the campaign is about and what the insurmountable up till now obstacles are in dealing with the British Museum. When Geoffrey says that 200 years of diplomacy has failed, unfortunately he's right. And that is something that the Greek government has to understand, and hopefully with the help of the Lefferts Foundation, which Geoffrey rightly acknowledged, and with others who are behind Geoffrey and his colleagues, we can ultimately get an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice as the only way that one can realistically articulate the case for the return of these cultural treasures and others to their source country. And that's articulated so well in both the English and Greek editions. Geoffrey has recently published an autobiography called Rather His Own Man. And I have to say that tonight, I think you will all agree with me, that Greece has found its own man. And with that, I congratulate you, Geoffrey. I think it was an excellent presentation. And we are just so heartened and pleased to be in your company and in your presence, and you're an inspiration for all of us. I'll just quickly add two things. In my observations in dealing with the British Museum, Geoffrey touched on this, they do engage in historical revisionism. They're very good at it. And interestingly, Geoffrey touched on the return of Indigenous remains. In his book, he's devoted a small chapter to the Guagal Shield. Now, the Guagal Shield belonged to, we paid our respects to the Gadigal people of this country. Their brothers in Botany Bay encountered James Cook when he first arrived in 1770. And in one of the melees that occurred, they dropped a shield. It was probably shot at, and it was taken by Captain Cook, and it is presently in the British Museum in the rather ironically named Enlightenment Gallery. It's not very enlightened to have this shield there, but interestingly, Australians of Indigenous background, and Geoffrey's leading the cry for this, and Peter Fitzsimons, the journalist, has also written about this, are asking for that to be returned as a symbol of what happened to Australia, to the Indigenous people, when the British first arrived. Now, even McGregor, the director, when he wrote a book about the history of the world in the British Museum, a very pretentious title, acknowledged that the shield was taken by Captain Cook. But suddenly in the last few years, the British Museum has unearthed some research to suggest that it's not really the shield that was dropped with the encounter with Captain Cook, so it's not really that important to return. Why? because they're afraid of the precedent it would create with the Elgin marbles, with the Parthenon sculptures. And that's what the British Museum's about. 200 years of diplomacy has been useless. It's time for a change. And again, I think Geoffrey Robertson has articulated this case better than anyone, together with his colleagues Amal Clooney and the never to be forgotten, the immortal Norman Palmer that I had the privilege to meet. The legal advice that they furnished, which is encapsulated in this book, is excellent, and hopefully the Greek government will take heed and we will see developments in the future that will lead to a positive outcome in due course. Without further ado, I want to acknowledge, as James did at the outset, the help of the Athenian Association, who have been fantastic, HEPA, who's helped sponsor this function, Greek City Times, who have also weighed in. We've got media representatives, Themikalos, George Silvanis, Elaine Kintas from the Greek Australian media. The Hepans have been fantastic in providing support. It's great to see the Greek community get together, but we also have Australians of not just Greek heritage, but Philhellenes who have put up their hands, because this is a cause that is really a noble cause that we should all pursue to obtain justice. And finally, Jim Chalakis. What a great MC. Put a hand for Jim. Thank you for your help. And once again, I move a formal vote of thanks for Geoffrey Robertson QC. A fantastic performance. Geoffrey has kindly offered to sign copies of the books. For those whose Greek is perhaps not as good as it should be, I suggest, with respect, you buy the English and Greek editions, because, as I'm finding, I can easily have, I've got an English translation for words I don't understand when I'm reading the Greek edition. So it's a very good way to improve your Greek by having both books. And that's not just plugging it for the purpose of sale. Thank you once again.
And that brings the evening to a conclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, books are for sale at the back, and I believe that Mr. Robinson has kindly agreed to sign your name in the book. David? And we, of course, need to thank Sydney Girls High School for this wonderful venue. Most of you know we had to move the venue from the new auditorium to this one. Thankfully we did, because we had far too many people to fit in the new auditorium. Thank you very much, and we'll see you again.